And before we get started on the actual discussion, it'd be awesome to get some intros from the rest of you. So starting clockwise, Andrew, fire away.
Good afternoon. My name's Andrew Wasdale. I'm the AIB Merchant Services General Manager. I've been in the role about a year. And previously to that, I had 15 years at Lloyds Bank Cardnet.
Szabolcs Agardi with a name that nobody can pronounce, so please call me Sabi. Working for Mastercard Data and Services, which is the part of Mastercard giving advices, basically everything which is around payments for issuers, acquirers, gateways, technical companies, big merchants. And in topics like strong customer authentication is also part of it. Happy to be here.
Hi, everybody. Is this working? Yes. Marco Conte, 10 years in payments. My SCA story started in July 2018 when my boss came to me and said, like, here is PSD2 and take a look at it. Work for payment service providers, Wirecard in Germany. I think everybody knows them for different reasons. And last summer, launched my own company called Congrify, where basically, Neil, you're here. You were talking before, it's all about data. That's what we say. It's all about data and unlocking insights. That's how we are helping companies, fintechs, payment service providers to actually understand their data. And especially when it comes to SCA, there is a lot to understand. Happy to be here.
I'm Paul Rodgers, delighted to be back on stage. I've been involved in on SCA since similar sort of time, August 2016, 6 years, 7 years, just trying to bring some sense to the whole thing. It's been an interesting road, but I think we all need to just relax about it because it's going to be here for at least another 7 years.
It definitely feels like the title of Work in Progress was the right one. So to start off with, I was going to say to you guys, we do have Slido, so please do get your questions into us and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible at the end of the panel. I think a good place to begin with my questions would be, how has the implementation unfolded across Europe? And what are some of the most common errors that you guys have seen thus far?
Well, why don't I kick off? I'm in a pretty unique position from Vendorcom, being able to look across all of the different stakeholders, different geographies, from the merchant side and the solutions provider side, but also working with the regulators as well on this. A little bit more focused on the UK, but I sat on the UK Financial Conduct Authority's monitoring forum for SCA. I've been really engaged in getting really good input from legal firms, the likes of Vixio and others, looking at what's going on around the different regulatory domains. And so the way I'd characterize it is it's been implemented on a very variable basis. There's very little consistency. And I guess kind of no real fault, no real blame there, because that was ever the way that it was going to be, because there really isn't that coalescing force to bring together each of the different regulated entities. We've got SCA implemented to the variety of almost as many banks as there are in the ecosystem, because the control was largely, from a card perspective, was largely taken away from the one sort of coordinating force that we've got of the card schemes working together. We've seen great consistency in the past where PCI, EMV really brings the industry together, and we haven't perhaps seen that. And so because the core regulated entities are largely operating to their own requirements, because that's what they have to do, we then see that diversity then just spread out in the industry, so that when you've got 10 million merchants around the European scene, then it's just confusion. So we're broadly there.
Connected to that, and reflecting what you said. So as Mastercard side, obviously we are seeing both sides, issuing, acquiring. And the biggest burden was on issuers, to be honest, to manage all these alternative potentials, how you can initiate a 3DS transaction, what sort of exemptions you can use. And country by country, the methods to manage all these alternatives is completely different, as well as their reactions on decline codes and such, that sometimes challenging the industry, what actually it means. But luckily, I would also say that in the last 2 years, the performance is changing on a way that it's improving heavily, as well as, yes, exemptions are more and more used. And to be honest, also, I would say that on the fraud ratio, it still stays on an appropriate level, that with the increase of SCA exemptions, I would still encourage everyone on the market to look into that when certain SCA exemptions can be used, where, of course, not blindly. So there comes whether you use it for a card coming from different region may not be the best approach, or recognizing your cardholder or your client. It's quite important when you, for instance, using TRA exemption.
I think it's fair to say it has settled down, but in the early days it was very clunky. Yeah. I guess we were in a fortunate situation. I'll be parochial for a moment, in that I was linked to 2 big issuers, and so we were able to help the merchant in the early days of the trial and the test to see what was happening to what the message was, what the flagging, and put a lot of work in with the PSPs to get the flagging right, because I think that's where it was going wrong. It didn't help the MPIs kept going down as well, and that's where the merchant started to lose confidence, because it was inconsistent as we're going into this new world. And I'll call Mastercard out, that they were very helpful to us as well in those early days, getting the flagging right, getting the data point, and helping the PSPs to present the transaction in a way that the issuer could do something with it. And I still see some of those issues still resonate today, particularly, as you say, if you've got one leg out, if you've got cards outside the region, it's making sure that the PSP has the ability, whether they're using the fraud tool, to separate those bins so that we're not trying to authenticate an American transaction. So I think that element is really important, but it has settled down to a high degree, and it does come down to the work. Lots of acquirers have done this. You work really hard with the gateways and the PSPs, and I think that where you absolutely get back what you put in there.
But you have to be very careful that on a UK-based issuer, having a completely different technical setup, whether certain things are answered if it comes straight to authorizations or not, compared to the continental Europe, where issuers had a bit shorter period of time to prepare. And it's reflected also on the way where the logics are built up for decision taking.
I take your point, and I've got to say this because the guys at the back, AIB have got, they're a very big European acquirer in the e-com space. And again, they use the same principles. They work very hard with the PSPs, put a lot of work in, and getting the messaging right was the key. And the big gateways they're using, we've seen the benefits. So I take your point about the UK, and in my previous world, it was very simple because it was very domestic, and it was just ironing out some of the basics. But when we look at the AIB book, it is much broader, and it does go across continental Europe. But the effort and the key was getting hold of the PSP gateway and getting that put right.
The codes are quite interesting so as an advisor or consultant, when you're looking at some of the data, and it can be specific to each acquirer and or PSP, but the codes are fairly similar in the kind of decline area when it comes to 3DS. If you look at cardholder or sort of customer or authentication error, it's quite a catch-all. Yeah. And when I looked into it, actually, the particular client, 15 to 18% was a 3DS challenge issue, but because it says, it's the customer's error, what was happening, the customer was abandoning, and I had to figure out, why is the customer abandoning? So there was 2, anecdotally for everyone, there was 2 perfumeries, shall we call it, that were selling in the particular market. Number 1 in the market was doing millions of euros a month and had a very low decline abandonment rate. And then perfumery 2, shockingly, I was looking, had like a 52% decline abandonment rate. So 48% or 52% was being left on the table for revenue and commercial. And I was like, what's going on? So I had a look at it, and it actually comes down to then client servicing. So then comes down to what's the merchant doing. So you look at the website. And so Perfumery 1, the progress to checkout was a 2-step process. Mm-hmm. Perfumery 2 was a 10 or 11-step process. I was like, And so just by interacting with the merchant, and it sounds quite rudimentary, it doesn't go on that often, I'm not speaking for all the acquirers, but in this particular case, there was no interaction. And so by just interacting and then explaining to it, and then talking to that merchant, they could change their setup. Number 2 in the market suddenly became number 1 by a stretch. Mm. But it started from a broad brush catch-all code.
Yeah.
But if I connect, just 30 seconds to what you were saying, Jimmie, like the implementation part. I mean, 4 years ago, payment service providers, gateways were in a rush mode. They were just implementing 3DS2 as 3DS1 was working in order to make it seamless for the integration for the merchants. Yeah. And that's, if you're a specialist, that's not the right way. 3DS2 can work in a really seamless way. There's like 3-4 steps. And today, it will be very interesting to go to the same gateways that 3 years ago did it as 3DS1. Did they upgrade it? Do they offer now a real 3DS2 native experience? If I buy on Amazon, that's a different story. Yeah. If I go to booking.com, it's a really seamless experience. And then you end up recharging your car in an EAV charge, and you go on your mobile and you have 4 or 5 different redirections. Obviously, that's why you have 50% of abandonments. Yeah. And that reconnects to the work in progress. Implementations, you need to see how you're offering.
And don't forget, standards are changing, as well as there are new features, free RI, whitelisting. Also, ACS providers are changing their systems, so you might have done something yesterday well, tomorrow may not, because they changed the system, some logic changes, and then you have to reflect on that. As well as, don't forget again that some cardholders are maybe coming from that background that for 50 years they were sharing their username and password, doing transactions from the bank account, and all of a sudden, why do I have to have now a separated username and password using the bank app solution for authentication? So there are also some different solutions and issuers which, yes, the authentication ratio can be varied. But that's the reason where then comes the next question, okay, what alternative on merchant side and acquirer side exists to overcome the shortage of some cardholders and some issuers?
Sure. On that point, I'm surprised there has been greater adoption of Apple Pay and Google Pay, because that seems to have resolved, and it, again, early days, a bit clunky, and then I think that's helped settle the market and increase the acceptance rates. And I'm still staggered how many merchants, although it's often built into the gateways, don't offer it. And it's a simple way. I think there's a number of tools there. Again, incumbent on the acquirers to work with the merchants to explain and expose all the tools that are available to get these transactions through.
Yeah, but here comes whether gateway acquirer is actually there to support the merchant and ready to support the merchant with all those features that you just explained. Yeah. Because that's another thing is that, okay, it's there, but is it really there? Is something that merchants may familiar what it means that when they send this or this or this for the whitelisting coming now or for the MIT to introduce, because the border behind whether something card present, card not present is a bit disappearing.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And there, of course, yes, it has a cost impact. That's true.
Yeah, well.
But on the other hand, the customer experience is also different once you're naming some taxi apps that where you just seamlessly doing the payment without you effectively taking any action.
Like to pick up on Neil's point earlier, we're expecting the consumer to be deeply embedded in this process when they frankly have got either very little interest other than understanding that they are protected. But actually extending that a stage further, we're expecting a lot of merchants to really engage with this process when they're not the regulated entity. And actually, it's great to see so many merchants at this event. But a merchant with a dedicated payments director, payments manager, or whatever. That's the exception. Yeah. Most merchants might have a basic general accounts receivable process, maybe has someone responsible for finance in general. They really aren't engaging with the in-depth nature of all of the change that's going on in payments. So for us to expect the merchants to really do this, it's just not going to happen. And that's where the pressure is on the gateway, but primarily on the acquirer. We have fragmented the flows in the merchant payment process, and I'm not sure that that's serving us well right now in the adoption of new standards, new regulations, and particularly getting it to market quickly. Innovation's great. We all want to see that happen. Innovation in new technology, new standards, and regulations. But unless those that are bringing those innovations into the market understand every step that needs to be put in place for it really to happen, then unfortunately some of the great advantages, whether it's fraud reduction or better customer experience, it's not going to be realized until we recognize the interdependencies in merchant payments. So this is where I think strong card schemes, strong acquirers, they're very, very important for the well-being of this industry, because we've seen real success where the card schemes have been able to work together for the good of the industry. And I fear from a regulatory perspective, there's too much beating up of these powerful but important entities within the ecosystem.
Well, we have dashboards, to be honest, that acquirers can reach that, check whether they are compliant. We have platforms where they can check against benchmarks. We have manuals where it's clearly described what you do, for instance, for an initial recurring or MIT transaction and how to present it in the subsequential MIT recurring transactions. Because obviously, as soon as these are not really followed, then the issuers, yes, they are sometimes conservative, let's call that way.
Yes. And I wonder, I'm conscious a bit of time. Obviously, we've covered some best practices there, and certainly those common errors that we have seen since implementation has taken place. One of the things that I've been following quite closely in terms of my reporting has been the exemptions, and particularly the EBA Q&As, which can be quite a mouthful at times. On the subject of exemptions, how has this worked thus far? It'd be great if someone could take that.
I think you go first. From my experience, again, having the grown-up conversation with the merchant, explaining, the liability they're going to take on, the implementation, and again working with the issuer so that when we put it in, we can actually see it, so we can make sure that it's being received and it's correctly implemented by the gateway. I would say generally it's gone really well, and again that's probably helped us in our European expansion, because lots of transactions fall under the under the limit, under the TRA, and so it's enabled more transactions in a seamless way. And it goes back to what you said at the beginning, Neil. Payments will need to become invisible, and the point you're making, Paul, it's got to go down to every merchant, not just the big ones who have got the payment infrastructure and the technology. It's all there. So,
I think, and also so contrary to obviously fabulous what you do, and if you go out into Europe and some of the smaller entities, whether it's smaller acquirers, etc., and kind of the education around it, I don't think exemptions has been explained particularly well. Or if it has, they've forgotten. And so one example is that one client's not using any exemptions at all, even 30 and below. And I looked and I was like, well, why? And then we're scared, we don't know, we don't want to be liable. I was like, but yes, but if you've got robust systems, you've got good people.
Fraud tool.
It's fraud tool.
It's a package. Yeah. It's not, as you say, it's not just one element.
No.
And I think that's how the proposition is presented to the merchant, so they understand what they're getting into and the protection that it affords them. Yeah. And then hopefully they'll see the increase in acceptance.
But that's where we're, sorry, please. Thank you. So that's where we are actually called a couple of times. Yes, that okay. What should I do? what's going wrong. And of course, sometimes it's really the issuer, but there may be, again, with the TRA, with whatever exemptions, you may manage to at least reduce that difficulty what an issuer has. Yeah. As well as, answering here one of the questions, MITs is definitely something where if you're following the rules and you have a proper initial transaction for an MIT, then the MIT has a much better success on acceptance. Where also on 3D Secure 2.2, you already have a flag optional. What's your risk ratio on that acquirer? So there are certain things that for the issuers helping to also reaching a higher performance, where yes, we are measuring performance, acquirers, issuers as well, and where we see an underperformance, we are coming there for help. That, okay, you may need to look into this, and this, and then improve it on a level that at the end everyone benefits out of it.
I think that's the key. It's got to go across the whole network.
We shouldn't be surprised, because if you think way back now, like a dinosaur, if you think back to Magstripe and then the migration to chip and pin, that was complex enough, just asking people to find 4 digits, to remember them and input it. You to listen to our conversation around 3D Secure PSD2, flags, fields. We shouldn't be surprised that it's complex. We shouldn't be surprised at the problems. And it is work in progress.
But the question which I have, I'm like, you were saying you go and you help, but the question is like for merchants, I mean, we talk about acquirers and issuers, are merchants always allowed actually to leverage and take advantage of exemptions? I can tell you from my experience, there is acquirers, payment service providers here on this conference that if you go to them, they might say no, because they might just say, we don't do it for you. And not everybody is allowing you to do TRA. That's the reality.
Yeah, we're seeing that a lot across the Vendorcom merchant cohort. A lot of them coming to me with, again, very variable experience in terms of depending on what acquirer they're using. If they're using multiple acquirers, it will then vary and will affect the consumer's experience depending on which acquirer is picking up that transaction. And the consumer might actually get a different response using the same card for the same product with the same value, depending on how that has been routed. And it is basics like the low value threshold, TRAs, just not being available. And a lot of merchants coming to me now saying, can I pick this up with the regulators? Because the legislation has built in an exemption, which is no longer being made available. And well, it's available, but only if you start then buying additional products from the acquirer. And that just doesn't sit that well with me in terms of if I know it's going to cost more to process that and so on. But yeah, we just need to look at, is this just another way of making money within the ecosystem now that the regulators have hammered interchange? Somebody's got to find the money from somewhere, so let's add something else into the mix.
But by TRA, obviously on a guest checkout, you may not use TRA, as well as if you recognize that maybe a card is coming from, I don't know, Australia, time zone on the device is US, and you have a delivery address in Germany, there maybe have a doubt whether the TRA is the best one, but also, of course, depends on high risk or non-high risk merchants, as well as their, and here comes, of course, SCA and exemptions. You also need a good fraud monitoring on top of that, when actually this sort of exemptions can be executed at all.
Well, that's where data comes in handy. That comes back to my first point, is you've got a wealth of data. You use Nethone as an example, using 5,000 different attributes to identify whether it's me. At that point, whether it's guest checkout or otherwise, just because that looks erroneous, could well be me. I could have flown from there, my mother lives somewhere else, I'm ordering flowers for a friend. Like, it doesn't mean it's not me. And so then we go back to your point, Andy, about involving the consumer again. Yeah. How do you pull the consumer out of it? They literally just want to buy something. It's as simple as that.
But Neil, I mean, it's all about data. I mean,
Absolutely.
like, if you want to optimize, it's about data. There is no question. That's the path. but what if you don't give me the data? I mean, like what I see, and I know merchants that are having like, multiple PSPs, like 5, 6 integrations. PSP 1 gives you data that you get on a 3DS server level.
Yeah.
PSP 2 gives you literally nothing.
Yeah.
And
it's a valid point. It needs standard.
then what do you do? I mean, like, it's not that you go there and, you want to understand if a transaction is going frictionless or not. You actually need exemptions. You can do data enrichment and go through the 3DS directory server and, get a TRA applied by the issuer. But you need to know, you need to get the responses. And let's keep in mind that you might get declines which are on the 3DS rail, which were coming before on authorization level.
Yeah.
Right? And those data are not coming back from some providers. So that's the work in progress. I mean, work needs to be
as
done.
you said, the issuers are returning decline codes which sometimes not necessarily logical.
No.
And there you have to retranslate what could that be. And of course, if it reaches a certain size, there you may ask, scheme, please help. And yes, I understand. And there, of course, in certain scenarios, there's a reason most probably that we are like really on the marketer and helping in these scenarios to review what you should do.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm not going to defend the issuers, but they don't want to decline it.
No, absolutely. It's their interest to have it authorized.
We've got to get to the nub of what's going on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where people in the ecosystem have got to work together to sort this out. The analysis of declines is really should be really close to our hearts, because that's where we can really add value. And to your point, Paul, it's not about, I don't think it's about selling products, it's about protecting the merchant.
Yeah,
so merchants who are not being offered TRAs, obviously it's competitive, they need to go to another acquirer and talk it through. It was always felt that the TRA would become a negotiation. I haven't seen it yet, but maybe that's on its way, because increasing the acceptance is key to the merchant, because how much ever they've spent trying to market to get the people to their checkout page for it to then fail is disaster.
Yeah.
And that's the bit, and the issuer doesn't want to decline it, but they're having to, because for some reason the way it's been presented is confusing, and they're getting a mixed message, which means that they have to push it back or soft decline it, and then you're into a different area.
It's even worse. In certain scenarios, there are merchants, they are sending transactions that requesting for 3D secure. There is a particular field saying, I want you, dear issuer, that you do 3D secure. Yeah. Then the issuer has no choice. They have to initiate the 3D secure process. Is it successful all the time? No. But then they cannot even look into the issuer TRA approach, because, dear merchant, you know better who is maybe behind of your screen. If you say so, then we follow that what you ask for. And connected here for trusted beneficiaries, it's relatively new. But I would tell that, I can say already that on there where it has been implemented by issuers, it's working well. But of course, also it means that that particular issuer not necessarily will enable for every merchant in the world to be registered on the list of their trusted beneficiaries.
To say one other side topic which we can either debate now or after is, whilst we're all focused on 3D Secure, PSD2, and PSD3, the problem of fraud still exists.
Yeah.
And so there is a high danger that, and it is happening, that 3D Secure is intercepted, and there's high, we were just talking about it before the session, there's a high rise in smishing and people clicking on links from texts that appear to be from your bank. And it sounds new, but I mean, social engineering has been around since I've been doing payments 30 plus years, and probably before that. But it's quite overwhelming and complex for the average consumer that's not in the industry, especially certain demographics, certain age groups. And you're going to click on that link, and all of a sudden you've given away, your data and or an OTP that might come through. So OTP is quite a weak link in that instance. We were talking about it earlier, and that scares me, because we're focused so heavily, all our energy in this area. We don't take our eye off the ball with that analogy of squeeze the balloon, it comes somewhere else. That will never go away. It'll always happen.
And I think fraud is quite a good kind of topic to match with SCA, considering the requirements in it. And with SCA, have fraudsters found ways of bypassing it thus far? I think that would be good for the panel to discuss.
Well, I can say that on the very beginning, low value was a great opportunity for everyone to start in an easy way with exemptions, also for fraudsters. That made, of course, issuers a bit sensitive since that low value may be not necessarily the best exemption that you should use. But also it comes to the other end that whether TRA on that particular acquirer or on that particular merchant category or on that amount is available, but definitely a TRA returning a much higher success ratio than when you're sending a low value. So that's, for instance, one of the frauds. Also, I can say that there was a period of time when for MIT and recurring, you were having initial transactions without authentications. This time is over, at least for Europe. And there are tricks that how these initial trying to go through. And if it successfully goes through, then immediately coming then the MIT with that. So therefore, it's quite important that these elements are by issuers heavily in the focus that don't allow these tricky initials to go through without authentication.
I sort of draw on your example of the balloon. You know, all we've done is seen the fraud either they've got more sophisticated, so it's account takeover, or it's gone to Moto, and that's been our biggest concern in protecting the Moto part of the market. And obviously, the instruments like Pay by Link has been very successfully rolled out to protect, but that's where we've seen it go.
Exactly.
You know,
there is a lot of merchants who are like, whether it's with the support of gateway or not, I don't want to go to that direction, but you're right. Avoid PSD2, the Moto is an alternative, but on Moto, the fraud ratio is recognizable.
Yeah.
So everywhere we are saying that it's there. Why don't you use Pay by Link? That's the easiest way, and then you get the similar result. Unless, of course, if the issuer having a free ACS
but I
difficulties.
I think that plays to Paul's point that people who are running their business, if they're a big company and then they've got specialists within that and roles, if you've got the SME retailer and he's got too much to do and he hasn't got time to read everything and he needs someone to sit him down to take him through, look, this is what you need to do to protect yourself.
But if you see that a merchant is coming with a Moto, and of course you will see fraud for sure, then it's worth to say, dear merchant, use Pay by Link.
Absolutely, but it's then helping them adopt it.
Oh yes, absolutely.
It's taking them on the journey. So one is knowledge and the other is helping them with the implementation.
Yeah, now you have to be active on that, of course.
I mean, the question is like how much active you can be. I mean, you're an acquirer, you're a payment service provider. You can't go to 1,000 merchants and take them one by one. I mean, like that's the question before who should do action, who should take action. Right? Is a merchant going to an issuer sometimes if it's large enough? Is the gateway actually capable of having all those resources? I mean, like you don't have thousands of people doing customer service for merchants on the acquiring side.
No, but the Moto is a particularly easy catch.
That's true.
There you can easily decide that, okay, no, I send out an info pack and then please look into that. It's easy to implement. Why not to use that one? But you're fully right. Keeping merchants up to date, that's an effort.
Yeah, it's a real struggle. I think the question that's come through about how small and medium merchants faring in this market right now, again, it's very variable depending on the type of relationship that they've got with their payment solutions provider. It might be an ISO, it might be a gateway, it might be an acquirer that's taking the lead in that relationship, but very, very few acquirers can reach down into that small and medium merchant. I spent last week with one of the major acquirers at their customer advisory board meetings and probably met with 100 merchants or more. And it was good to see that level of interaction. Now, these weren't the very small merchants, 5 million to 50 million turnover, so actually pretty reasonable sized merchants. But it's nice to see that sort of interaction going on where we can have good questions being asked. There are, with today's technology, there are good ways of getting out to that long tail of merchants, whether that's videos or it's data sheets and so on. Now, most very small merchants, the owner shop the owner is a shop assistant. They are everything. They're stocking the shelves, and that's what they're really spending time on. They have very little time to even engage on the basic payment information. So this is where I think more merchant and retail trade associations should be working more closely with their merchants. Small merchants actually work really well together, so that in the same way as we learn how to pay and what's secure, and not as payments professionals, but it's just when we're young, taking on new payment methods and so on. It's just that socialization. And again, this is where perhaps we shouldn't beat ourselves up and work to regulators' timescales. We might just need to be a little bit more relaxed and say, these new innovations, whether it's regulation or technology or whatever, are going to take a generation, 15, 20 years just to be put into normal society. Contactless payments, everybody says, yeah, it's great, it's ubiquitous. But actually, in most European jurisdictions, it was being implemented around the 2006, 2007, 2008. That's 15 years ago. We're only now getting comfortable. And that's at a period where COVID gave it a big boost. So maybe we just need to be a bit more relaxed, and maybe even regulators need to be a bit more relaxed. And that's difficult when you've got a situation where fraud is real, and we need to sometimes just make a big intervention. But actually making that big intervention with those organizations who have got the capacity to make those changes quickly, the high volume, the high value center of the bell curve of transactions, just be a bit more relaxed about some of these organizations that might make it might be a little bit more difficult because it's not going to have as big an impact on the economy. Although the fraudsters will go there. But in that case, then maybe that will be the incentive for those organizations to take action.
I agree with what you say. Going back to a point you made right at the beginning, it is about communication and how you reach out to the merchants. And this is a bit of a plug because over the last 6 months, we've run a series of webinars aimed at very straightforward elements of the business, trying to reach out into the tentacles of the smaller and the SME merchants. And it's worked really well because it's a video. They can see it, it's stored, they can do it out of time, but you still have to get them to come to the web to see it. But it is about education. And then when you communicate, you have to make sure you're clear. Because this can get really complicated. And the minute you start talking technical to the guy who's got too much to do and he's trying to stock his shelves, it's got to be really, really easy to understand and offer that support to help them become live.
But you're saying it's all about education. Like we say, we need to educate merchants. But if you are an acquirer, are you educating your sales representatives, which are the first point of contact for the merchants, enough? I hope you do. But what I'm seeing in the industry is that sometimes I talk to people which are working for large PSPs, and they might be new to the industry, like first, second year. And they need to go and talk about 3D Secure and TRA out of 100 different topics with the merchants. And there is a bit of confusion. So it's very important for the PSPs themselves, when they are really large organizations, to educate the people properly about those topics.
But maybe it's not on day one when you sell it. Maybe once you see the performance is X and you see that there is a space for improvement, then it makes sense for everyone, merchants to gain more income, gateway to get more traffic on them through. So to be honest, I agree. Maybe on the time zero or day zero, maybe it's not the one to start with, but maybe day two. Sorry, but there was one question I wanted to reflect on, whether the PSPs their compliance is monitored. So at least by us, we are having such monitoring that whether issuer or acquirer is compliant. So if you mean PSP acquirer, then yes, the acquirers are monitored by us. And there are incentives around to make them compliant. Same for the performance. There are certain performance expected that to reach that, there are again certain incentives to make them move and reach that. And Yes, and then in case help needed, then it's us to come around and happy to help. Sorry, just that question was really important for me to reflect that this compliancy topic is definitely on the list and included.
And you're right. At that initial point of sale, when you're closing out the sale, often merchants just want to take the car, and they don't want to hear anything else. One, because they think they're being sold to, and they think they just want to get going, and so they may not be receptive. So, unfortunately, the experience that they then have will make them sort of come back to
I think it's a really
accessible.
We were preparing some one-pagers or two-pagers in certain cases for certain merchants where exactly this has been introduced, that you don't have to do that, but this is the amount you lost.
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Yeah, it's a really important point. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of the merchant and really understand what they're trying to achieve. And most merchants in the current economic crisis are just trying to keep the lights on. They don't have the capacity to be doing many of these other things. So they need to be persuaded about why it is important for themselves and for the economy as a whole, for the well-being of their employees and for the well-being of their customers. But we can't just say this is being mandated, therefore you need to do it. They will not see it that way. We need to explain it in ways that's important to them. The way, as I look at it in general, though, we are where we are, but we can help. And we've got such a variety of different challenges with this. So this is where I think as an industry, we do need to come together to make sure that everything that has happened to cause this level of detriment in the industry right now isn't allowed to persist when we get to PSD3. If anything we could do to help bring the regulator on board so that this whole process, so that they're not thinking in a banking mindset and trying to apply it to payments. Because we've talked largely about card payments. As we start to see open banking initiatives start to come into the merchant payment, inbound payments to merchants, then we're going to see SCA applied in a new form of payment as well. And that's not socialized amongst this group mainly at the moment. So we've got a long way to go, but I think we, representing the industry together with the merchants, we need to make sure our voice is heard now amongst the regulatory community.
But where it can go wrong? Everywhere. It could be the cardholder, it could be the gateway, it could be the ACS provider from issuer. There is a network connection issue. So,
but it comes back to my very nice because we're coming up time. Comes back to the presentation of my first point, commerce. We need to try and, as leaders in the industry and as part of the industry, we need to make it simple, both for merchant and for consumer.
Yeah.
Because without those two, there is none of this. And so we need to figure this out. I wouldn't say quickly because 7 years has not been quick, but we do need to be on the path. We do need to be cohesive, Paul, as you rightly pointed out. We need to figure this out. How do we keep it simple, stupid, to allow commerce to happen in a less frictional way than it does today?
Absolutely.
Still with the fraud level.
Keep the fraud down. Don't need to open the doors.
And I wonder, as we're coming up to the end of the session, it'd be great to summarize if you had like one piece of advice to merchants in the audience who are here today on dealing with SCA, making sure that it kind of moves to being business as usual rather than a work in progress. What would that piece of advice be?
I mean, from my side, I would just say get educated and own the data. Actually look at your data daily. And if the PSPs don't give you the data, well, go and ask for the data.
From my side, even if you do an analysis today working well or working not perfectly and you may find a solution today, don't stop. Continue because issuers are changing their systems. Your acquirer is changing their systems. It is a continuous monitoring that you have to do.
Yeah.
I agree. It's all about communication. It's education. We've got to educate. That's the big thing. I'd say whether they talk to their acquirer, they've got to talk. They've got to get this right, and they've got to understand what's happening because they don't know. In many cases, to your point earlier, Neil, they don't know how much business they're leaving on the table, and the market's tough, and they can't lose a sale, and that's where they've got to be much more educated around that, and it's incumbent on us to help them. But so the one thing I'd say is they got to talk to someone. They got to get educated.
Ever.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it is a case of merchants of whatever size recognizing that the payments process is a core business process that they need to take seriously. They need to make more demands of the organizations that are providing solutions to them, and they need to make sure that they are keeping themselves aware of how it is affecting their business, for good or bad. I think there's real potential here, so I think they can. They just need to engage.
Great. Neil?
Yeah, I don't think everyone said everything, but summarizes, use the tools and the expertise that's available in the industry, central repository of information, and let's see if we can solve this.
Fantastic. Well, we've finished just about on time. So thank you very much to our panel and to everyone for coming along today. Enjoy the rest of your time at MPE.
Thank you.